Pastor Rick, and I'm here with me is my brother-in-law, Dr. Jeffrey Dupree, whose specialty is world history. Jeffrey, how many doctorates do you have?
I have one.
You have one.
Yeah.
And anyhow, he's a doctor and he has studied world history basically his whole life. And Jeffrey is going to now explain to us the cycle of civilization. So Jeff, would you?
Sure. When you look at any civilization, the key to anything is centralization of power. That's the vital thing. You don't have a state in order to form must become centralized in order to gain tax revenue. You know, the basics of any kind of sustainable kingdom or governance system is the ability and the presumption of the right to gather taxes from the masses and people under its influence. So that's a fundamental principle of statehood, is you must have a state that can gather the resources in. And that the big thing that does, if people give money to the state, that gives the state legitimacy. Mm-hmm. By the very act of sacrificing and whatever, or having required of you that you pay money to centralized government, you're instantly giving legitimacy to it. So that's always a prime role of any state, is the gathering of resources from the people. And then for that legitimacy, the state then has to do certain things on its own. This is why you have buildings being built, whether
right.
they're religious buildings, cultural buildings, roads, etc., making of law. This all legitimizes it, creation of a military, either for self-defense or to expand the state. So it's kind of a simple thing that legitimacy comes from gathering the resources, which then allows the government to expand and get more power.
Now, if you'd explain to the audience, since the beginning of civilizations, just about every great civilization has come, mm-hmm. grown, mm-hmm. achieved dominance, and then gone. Right. So would you walk us through that cycle?
Well, again, once you have that legitimacy, that establishes a state. The state then obviously has to defend itself against people from the outside, but typically speaking, as part of gaining legitimacy, and is to expand and get more people in and gather more. And it's kind of like I think football is such a great analogy to this, because the idea of moving forward and taking possession of land and building momentum in that with regard to statehood and encompassing more people to join. And because there is a constant threat from other states wishing to expand. So the growth of states through acquiring new territory and using force to do so is the normal cycle of joining. And any nation that is a nation today did this. Mm-hmm. So many people, and I'm not saying this is a bright moment of human history. This is what people do. And when I look at human history, I really advise students to try to against judgment and understand this is what happened. And when you start qualifying this as good or bad, you start going down a path that you're bringing your value system into a system that might have existed 3,000 years ago. And while there are some certain, you could say eternal ethics, and of course, but the idea this is just human behavior.
Draw a parallel, say, between the Roman Empire, which was hugely successful,
absolutely,
lasted hundreds of years, thousands of years, and the United States, which is kind of like a mini version of that.
Well, obviously, when you look at the United States, it really looked to ancient Rome very much for the whole idea of setting up as a republic. Mm-hmm. Rome was not a kingdom. They threw off the kings and the idea of a republic, and then what came from it, obviously, later on, after the republic had gotten to a certain point. And it's really ironic in the sense that Caesar, who was very much more of a populist than other dictators in the time, one of the troubles he got in with the Senate was his policy of Romanizing the tribal people and the barbarians that Roman and normalizing them and having a blending and taking these people into the Roman culture and giving them power, but also giving power to the plebs, who were the land grants to his soldiers and to the common people. And the aristocracy who assassinated him was actually a very conservative idea. They wanted to bring back the power of the Senate and the Republic, but what they also didn't like was the shift of wealth that Caesar was giving to the common people. And out of that, you had the Civil War, which, Augustus came strong, and then that's really started the empire as the empire they know with an emperor. And an empire has, as part of its contingency, they have to grow and expand. But that also leads to their death now. One interesting theory of the fall of Rome is based on the building of Hadrian's Wall, which was in Great Britain, where it says this is where the empire stops, and he, by and large, stopped a lot of the expansion of Rome. And many historians believe that kind of is what precipitated the fall of the Roman Empire, that it stopped expanding. But there are numerous theories about the fall of the Roman Empire. The biggest things is that the revenues required for constant warfare is what destroyed the Roman Republic. And there are other factors too. The Republic, or the empire, as it grew in territory, became more balkanized, with an inability to absorb culture, which Rome had done very well up until about the 3rd century AD. With parallel to the United States, it's really hard to compare. The United States is so young. I mean, the United States, as what I would say is a world power, really starts around the early 20th century with the Spanish-American War, which was a very overt. The Mexican War had been very localized, but the Spanish War really got the United States onto the world scene. And then after World War I, the United States was a player, but we decided not to play because of isolationism. And really then it was World War II and the economy, the industry, and then of course being the sole holder of nuclear weapons was what led to the United States as being the dominant, or a dominant superpower.
Where would you place us now if you were going to compare us to the Roman Empire? Where is the United States in our journey right now if you're going to draw a parallel?
Well, I would say we're not really an empire. We're obviously a nation's republic. Now, not without comment on our government system, we have a very strong centralized government, so that could be seen as a very much positive thing. A lot of people, depending on your political beliefs, might not like that idea of a strong government. But if you want to be a strong nation, you have to have a strong centralized government. The trends that you could look at Rome and say are troubling is an increased percentage of the income going toward military spending. And this has an effect that it impacts citizens, because you're taking dollars that you're spending on other areas that are not necessarily improving the country itself and the life of citizens itself. And you can say, well, you're doing this in the need of national interest and national security, which is reasonable. People can disagree on that. I would point that Eisenhower pointed out that there is obviously a nexus between the private sector, the political factors, the United States and the military, and how we spend military on the military. And I'm not anti-military, certainly military, but I think that's a concern. The expansion of power beyond the point of legitimacy. You might look at things that were created beyond in the last 75 years since the World War II. It changed things so much. Look at the expanse of government so much more. With in 1947, a banner year in our nation's history, the creation of the CIA and the NSA. These are new organizations that never existed. And if you looked at them from a value add thing, how many mistakes have they made? How many things have they messed up? Versus how many things have they gotten right? And then you might say, well, how much do we need them? And obviously the threats are very real. So these are all things that point to an expansion of government, which can be, again, different people look at it different ways. I think, though, that running an empire is costly, and this really did hurt. So much of the economy went toward waging war, committing to war, and so much of our national resources and wealth goes to defense purposes that are not really inherently designed for the defense of our borders.
So if you could make one wrap-up statement of how it seems that every nation that ascends to dominance eventually leaves the scene.
Yeah, the United States is very new on the scene. I would pose that the United States is obviously it's a nation. It's 250 years, thereabouts. But as a world power, it's less than a century.
Right.
And now things go a lot faster today, and that is a different factor. With the technology, communication, ability to make quick decisions and have huge impacts faster. Warfare is fought more quickly. Economies change more rapidly, and they're less stable than they were, obviously, in 2,000 years ago. So you have that factor, but it's really hard to compare the two, because Rome had competitors too, but it was more of a static environment. It was not as dynamic as today. And the idea of the United States is, as a superpower, it's a superpower, obviously. But there are other powers that exist, and the idea too that back then you didn't have the ultimate weapons that could change the situation within 5 minutes, and there are numerous countries that have that now.
So as somebody who studied this basically your whole adult life, do you feel that the cycle that has been established forever of establishment, ascendancy, decline, and fall is going to continue?
Absolutely. Nations come and go, but nations come and go.
Yes.
And because government change, because of other powers rising, and it probably will be no longer a situation that you have a power with, controlling 1/3 of the earth, like as Rome effectively did for 600 years.
So,
I don't think that's going to happen.
So you think we're at the end of that type of age?
I don't know about the end. I think you're going to have superpowers. I think that a more likely, depending on what you feel about the United Nations, obviously that's a good forum for the powers, and you have the 5 large countries that have, Security Councils, permanent members. I think they have obviously a lot of say on the world stage. There are other factors that may calm down the call for imperialism. One of the things, and people feel different about, is globalization. The idea of globalization has as a basis cooperation and to some extent compromise. So that might change the whole dynamic. But I think the idea of empires per se is not really the idea to go now. I think you have the idea of superpowers, and who are the economic superpowers? Obviously, the United States, China, Russia, which has greatly lessened since the breakup.
India.
India is the dynamic power. So you're looking at places that were. One thing I say to all students of history, and you look at history, you don't mess with China, because China's been on the world scene for 6,000 years. They had things that we are still wrestling with in this country with regard to their public law, etc., that they have had, in fact, for 5,000 years. Public health was a non-sequitur. It was something that they took for granted even 5,000 years ago in the large city-states of China. China has always been a big player. They took a big nap when they basically took a nap for 400 years,
right.
At around between like 1400 and 1800, and the Opium Wars. And out of the Opium Wars, when they awokened, and then after the revolution in 1948, they have kind of taken on that mantle place, that they see their place as a power, a kingdom, to be a dominant force in the world. So
they're the ones to watch.
Well, they've always been one to watch. Yeah. And if you look, like I said, you don't mess with, there's a sign, you don't mess with Texas. Well, in world history, most history professors would say you don't mess with China.
Well, Dr. Dupree, I want to thank you for being.
Just call me Jeff.
Well, you know what? Honor where honor is due. So,
it.
Dr. Dupree, I want to thank you for being on the show. I want to add that this cycle that we have seen of nation rising up and declining has gone on for as long as there's been nations. What we see as we dovetail into the book of Revelation, that there will come an end to this cycle, and that Jesus will ultimately set up his millennial kingdom. And so you say, where does it end? Well, if you believe in the Bible, it ends with the millennial kingdom, where Jesus rules and reigns on the earth. We don't know when that's going to be, but for those of you who believe in the Bible, that's what's coming eventually. So, Dr. Dupree, I want to thank you for being here. You're fascinating. And remember, with Jesus, there's always hope, there's always love. We will see you soon.